Hello and welcome back to Well That Aged Well. This week I'm joined by James Howard Johnson, who has written The Last Great War of Antiquity. And that is, of course, the topic we are going to discuss today. And I want to begin, before we go into the topic itself, why the title The Last Great War of Antiquity?
Well, of course, it's a question of when antiquity ended. And in my view, it ends when the Arabs take over most of the old world of the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. And so I place the end of antiquity um, if you, in the 640s, when the Arabs have conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and the whole of the Persian Empire. So it's in that sense, it's the last war between the great powers of the ancient world, just as the war between Persia, Achaemenid Persia, and the Greeks in the 5th century BC was the first Great War.
Mm. So while more older generation of scholars call this era the Byzantines, and it's more recent years, newer scholars, such as I believe yourself, have begun calling, as I say, in this era, still the Roman Empire, and that's I'm gonna try to call it the I wouldn't try to call it the Byzantine Empire, but the Roman Empire, as most scholars are trying to call it up until this point that you talked about in the 600s before they become called Byzantine Empire.
Yeah.
So I will try to call them Roman and not Byzantine. So let's begin with the state of the Byzantine Empire, and of course we're going to talk about the Heraclean Revolution in a few minutes. But I want to begin talking about the Byzantine Empire at this stage in the 7th century.
Um, well, the I'm going to go back to the terminology of sort of
Yeah,
east. It's the eastern half of the
yeah.
Roman Empire, and I should just say that what we refer to as the Byzantines, which is a term of art, they always referred to themselves as the Romans until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So it's simply modern scholars are making a distinction between the great empire of antiquity and its eastern half, which continued to exist until the 7th century, and the Rump Empire, which fought for survival against the Arabs in the 7th, 8th, and ninth centuries. Now, you're asking me about its state in the at the end of the 6th and beginning of the 7th century. Uh, it had fought 4 wars with the Persians in the course of the 6th century, winning and losing. Uh, it, it, I don't think that there was any fundamental change or fundamental weakening of the apparatus of the state or the economy or of the social order. But there had been one terrible blow, I mean, akin to COVID coming for us, which was the coming of bubonic plague in 640 in the early 640s, which like the Black Death in the 14th century caused widespread death, but not as widespread in the case of the 6th century plague, because I don't think it was pneumonic. So it's rather remarkable that the Romans and the Persians were at war at the time in 641, 642 when the plague appears, and there's an interruption of 1 year in the operations, first for the Romans in 642, then for the Persians in 643. But after that, they carry on as before. So I think it shook the world. I mean, many people died, but it didn't fundamentally alter it. So both great powers, East Roman and Persian, continue to have effective, efficient, relatively efficient state machines, could put large armies in the field, and economies that functioned well. The Romans having the Mediterranean, and the Persians by then being largely dominant in the Indian Ocean, and in both cities, and the social order were relatively unchanged.
Now, I want to refer to another historian whom we also had on the podcast, Adrian Goldsworthy, in his recent work on the Eagle and the Lion, where he talked about the relation between Persia and Rome. He spoke that though they fought these wars, they weren't really wars of territorial expansion, and it wasn't wars to annihilate one's empire. Like the Persians didn't fight to annihilate the Romans, and the Romans didn't really fight to annihilate the Persians. So were these wars thought about? Was it just brief expansion, or was it like for commercial gain, or what was there a reason? But was there
Well,
territorial gains these wars were fought for?
yes, there were territorial gains and territorial losses for the other side. Why were they fighting? I
Not
mean,
why were
if
they fighting, but what was there like legit claims for these wars? Like
right,
was there like I forget the words in I do have the words in my mind, but like was there
their motive or
commercial
their objective.
reasons? Yeah.
Well, the Persian Shahanshah, Khusro the Second, Aparvaz, went to war in early 603 on the pretext, but I think it was also genuine, that his benefactor, the Emperor Maurice, had been deposed and then executed by a usurper, a general from the Balkans called Phocas. So he had a genuine reason to go to war, which I think was more than a pretext. But he had another reason, which was that when Maurice, the Emperor Maurice, who reigned from 582 to 602 when he was executed, the Emperor Maurice had restored Khusro to his throne when he was ousted by a rebel.
So it was
He had,
loyalty in a sense.
yes, yes, but also there was quite a high price was paid in terms of in terms of territory. So about half of Armenia and half of what's now Georgia, used to be known as Iberia in that time, Caucasian Iberia, half was ceded to the Romans. And to the south of Armenia, you have the Taurus and Kurdish mountains uh, which run from from east to west, and the Kurdish Taurus. And under the terms of the treaty that Khusro had made with Maurice, uh, all the Kurdish Taurus range was ceded to the Romans, so they controlled the mountain passes between the northern sort of arena of operations in Transcaucasia and the southern in northern Mesopotamia. So this was a very substantial and, in military terms, significant cession of territory, which he Khusro wanted to reverse.
We mentioned Heraclian as well, and he is of course a player that comes in the scene. So let's give a little bit background on Heraclian and why the Heraclian rebellion, because it was quite a turbulent time in the Roman world, because there was quite a lot of few rebellions taking place, and of course that you
Yes,
talked about in the book as well, the sports team, support teams, the red and the blues, and they were part of this as well. That
yes.
stirred up this rebellion and the rise of Heraclian as well. So let's talk a little bit about the background of Heraclian and the start of the Heraclian dynasty, how he came to power.
Well, the I suppose the ultimate cause of all of this was dissatisfaction in the capital Constantinople with the Phocas regime on the part of the senators. And there clearly was some communication between the Senate in Constantinople and the governor of North Africa, known as the Exarch, who was Heraclius's father. So when Heraclius's father, together with his son, basically declared war on the regime, proclaiming the young would basically yes, it was basically hostile to Phocas. It was a rebellion that gathered momentum extraordinarily fast. So they managed to gain a control of Egypt, the great resource base of the Roman Empire, in well, in less than a year, in 619. Why? Otherwise, apart from political reasons, for other reasons, we don't really know. I mean, we do know, obviously, as you've alluded to, that there were urban riots headed by two um, sort of parties, but without a sort of political program, um, led by the circus factions. That is, by the supporters of one or other of the main racing colours. I mean, it all seems rather extraordinary in the 21st
Could you
century.
imagine if football teams was able to depose and pose politicians today like they did in the Roman world?
Yes, it is. It's that. Well, of course, at the time of a football competition like the Euros now, we can see that whole nations get quite absorbed
Mm.
in their country's fortunes. So it's something akin to that. But there are clearly, I think, also social and economic forces at work, and some of the leaders clearly make contact with the factions and sort of use them as a sort of a political support. That had also happened with churchmen disagreeing on questions of doctrine. They would try to activate the crowd to support them. So clearly, everything is not calm in the Roman Empire at the time, and what is the ultimate cause of it? I suppose it's just sort of anxiety about the future. It's as if they knew that something terrible was about to happen. I think that's all I can say.
So pretty much the same that happened in the United States this year then.
Yes, yes, it's too awful. It's too
Let,
awful
let,
to
let, let,
contemplate.
let's go back to the rise of Heraclian and what was he
Yes.
how did he have military experience or did he have was it just mere politicians who how did he get because he
Well, I
eventually
don't.
take the throne, don't he? And he does take dispose the usurper Phocas.
Well, his father had military experience. His father was a distinguished general, but as far as we know, he had none until the start of the rebellion. But it turns out that he was probably a young man in his 20s, and when they get into Egypt in 609, uh, the his cousin Niketas was left in charge of trying to get hold of the whole of Egypt and then repel the counterattack. But Heraclius goes off with the fleet, and the evidence is very, very sparse. But almost certainly, he went for Cyprus, and from Cyprus, he could set about trying to undermine the regime in the Middle East. And it was then from Cyprus that he sailed on to Constantinople. So actually, in terms of fighting, he didn't have to do that much before his accession to the throne, because the Phocas regime in Egypt, in a sense, collapsed from within. I mean, they had allies within Alexandria, the capital of Egypt, and Alexandria fell into their hands easily. And then the hard fighting in Egypt was done by his cousin. because he Heraclius was away. So his experience of war basically starts after he's on the throne. Doesn't go very well at the start.
So let's start. So it doesn't go very well, but how eventually managed to succeed. So what? Let's talk a little bit about the beginning of Heraclius' reign as new emperor. And of course, like you said, he finds new dynasty that lasts until Justinian II is deposed and murdered on the throne, which we also made an episode about, but that's another story. But let's talk a little bit about this early rule, and of course, I want to talk a little bit about Persia in a few minutes, but let's begin a little bit about Heraclian's early reign.
We oddly we've got very, very little information about the first 10 years of his reign. We hear about a rebellion of Phocas supporters against Heraclius, led by a relative of Phocas's in Asia Minor. Um, we uh, we hear about ceremonies elevating members of Heraclius's family, above all, his baby son, his eldest son, Heraclius, the new Constantine. Um, Otherwise, we're pretty much in the dark. Clearly, he consolidates his regime. He deals with the rebellion, and then his life is really taken up with the war against Persia, which continues to go very badly, as it had done in the reign of Phocas.
I wanted to, we don't need to talk about the war, of course, in a few minutes, but I also want to take a look at Persia and, like we said, talked about the Roman one. I want to talk a little bit about state of Persia. And sorry, I'm not gonna try to say the Shah's name. I'm gonna just get it wrong. But let's talk a little bit about. You mentioned that the Shah was deposed and that the Jane got back from in power again. So let's talk a little bit about the Persia as well. I feel like should know a little bit about them as well as we've heard because it was another great superpower at the time before,
Yes,
of course,
indeed. Yes, indeed.
before the Arabs, of course, took it over. But let's talk a little bit about the state of Persia as well.
Well, the I mean, Khusro, who was basically his father Hormizdas was killed in 589, and he then he took over briefly. Then he fled for asylum to the Romans, and the Roman government agreed to support his candidature as the rightful heir of his father. And the campaign to restore him went pretty well. It was almost a sort of surgical military strike, which resulted in regime change in a few months in 590. Uh, but the young Khusro, and I think he's still pretty young, he may still be a teenager at this stage, is very much the creature of his two maternal uncles, and of course of the Romans. So he spends about 10 years gradually establishing his power. I mean, he faced it's nearly a 10-year rebellion of one of his uncles operating in Iran with his sort of strongholds in the Elburz Mountains. So it was only by 599 that Khusro basically was firmly in charge. That's on the political side. Um, on more generally, I mean, Iran was a militarized, centralized state, uh, probably with some 300,000 men in its armed forces, with massive fixed defenses on its vulnerable frontiers in the north and the northeast. So it was a going concern, flourishing cities, flourishing Indian trade, an established aristocracy, where the hereditary principle really dominated everything.
Mm. So let's talk about the war itself, because like I said, it does begin to go very badly for Romans. And let's talk a little bit about the clashing in with the two armies of Persia and Rome.
So sorry, you wanted to know about as it were, the organization, the arms, and so on of the
Yes,
armies.
the army and the army had the battle and with against the Persians and as well, you know. I'm sorry
Um,
if I'm not sorry, but if I messed up a little bit there.
well, I mean, I think the armies were pretty well matched. Basically, the cavalry components became more and more important with the passage of time towards the end of antiquity. But cavalry armies, uh, though they were the principal striking force, they needed to be accompanied by infantry first for security reasons. Um, and the weapons they fight with archery, with spears, with swords. Um, that's the cavalrymen, and then you've got infantry again, spearmen and archers. Uh, we've got a Roman military handbook dating from the time from which we learned a lot about the Roman army. We don't have the same thing for the Persian army, but clearly they're well matched. Uh, what happens at the outset of the war is that there were Phocas faced serious rebellions from the commander in chief in the Middle East, so that the Persians deal with a divided Roman world, and they've got the support of the commander in chief in the frontier regions of Roman northern Mesopotamia. So they make some relatively easy gains in the south. I say relatively easy. It took them a year and a half or so to take out the great Roman forward base at Dara. Um, but then they advance. Um, they advance steadily westwards until they reach the Mediterranean in 610. So in 7 years, basically, they push right forwards. Now, compared to offensives, well, say the war, the war we see at the moment in Ukraine, these were dramatic advances. The Persians taking out the whole of the northern part of the Roman Middle East, while north of the mountains, the Kurdish Taurus, they made equally spectacular advances over the whole of Roman Armenia and Roman Georgia, right up to the old Euphrates frontier. So it was hard fighting in the first 8 years of the war. It was a war of attrition, but it was a war in which Persians probably had superior numbers and certainly were more united, and they made steady, remorseless progress year by year.
I want to talk a little bit about as well of the Arab world, but just at this time, of course, Islam is on the rise, and I want to talk a little bit about the state of the Arab world in the middle of all this as well.
Well, we of course for the Arab world we know even less than we know about the Persians. But what we do know, we know from the life of the Prophet, the Sirah, and around about the time that the Persians reach the old inner Roman frontier and the on the Euphrates, north of the mountains, and the Mediterranean, um, that is the time that Muhammad moves from Mecca to Medina. So it's the year of the Hijrah, 610. I should just specify 610 is the year when the Persians break through the inner Roman frontier and they get to the Mediterranean a year or two later, 611 or 612. Um, now, and then in 614, they capture Jerusalem. Now, I think there's a clear allusion to the Persian to a great Persian victory, which I think is their capture of Jerusalem in the Quran. Now, by 614, Muhammad has been in no, well, what am I talking about? I'm so sorry.
Hmm.
I'm confusing the date of the Hijra, which is 622 AD, with basically the start of Muhammad's preaching. Muhammad starts preaching around the year 610 and beginning to gather followers in Mecca. So I would say that around the year 610, Arabia is fairly quiet. The great city was Mecca. Mecca, I view Mecca as a sort of, it's like a city state, like sort of Athens and Thebes and Sparta in the classical Greek period, or like the great city states of Central Asia in late antiquity, Bukhara and in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, Bukhara and Samarkand, and others, and with trading connections with the south, South Arabia and the Indian Ocean, and with the north, the Roman world and the Persian world. Uh, and at this stage, 610, Muhammad's the only people really aware of Muhammad are those within Mecca and maybe some of the surrounding Bedouin tribes. I'm terribly sorry to have.
No, that's fine. I screw up as well. So it's both of us. We all make mistakes. But I wanted to ask about, you mentioned the capture of Jerusalem, but
Yes.
what I want to ask was that it would be later in the 11th, 12th century that was great significant that it was under Muslim rule when it was captured, when they captured Jerusalem. Was the capture of Jerusalem at this point in time significant to the Romans as well, or was
Oh,
it kind
yes.
of like
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Very significant to the whole, the whole Christian world, which meant the whole of Europe. Um, I'm afraid not the whole of the wonderful northern Scandinavian
mm,
extension of Europe, not there, but I would say, and not probably in Britain, but in the Frankish world, in the Visigothic Spain, in Lombard Italy, in North Africa, and the whole of the East Roman world, yes, highly significant and to Christians outside the bounds of the East Roman world. So there were lots of Christians in Iran and lots of Christians in Arabia, particularly in northern Yemen. So for all of these, it would have been a terrible shock. Um, Even though basically the Persians had intervened to stop a pogrom against the Jews in Jerusalem, and then they withdrew. They probably withdrew for about a year before they then took it over permanently. But it was the capture of the city by force which shocked the watching world.
was the thought of kind of sending support to Heraclius and kind of in a form of a early from what we would call later the Crusade was the thought about sending external help to help the Romans at this time, or whether like they tend to take care of this themselves.
No, I think that wasn't in question because the Germanic kingdoms established in the West really didn't have the sort of logistics organization or the ideological sort of openness to be able to think in that sort of way. I mean, it required an astonishing sort of leap of the imagination to envisage sending a large force of men basically overseas or a very, very long land journey to the Holy Land. So, no, the Germanic world really was ideologically dependent on the East Roman world. So they looked up to the empire. They knew that this was the highest sort of authorized rule, a divinely authorized rule on earth. So they simply watched.
Mm. And so the thought of because everything seemed to go wrong and the Persians seemed to be gaining victory after victory. So when does things turn for Heraclius and when does despite all these setbacks, how does he manage to recover or does he recover the lost territory that the Persians had gained?
Well, yeah. I should just say by way of a preamble that um, if the first phase of the war was a war of attrition, which brought the Persians to the Euphrates, that is between 603 and 610, we then have a period from 610 to 621, in which, as you indicated, the Persians advanced much more rapidly and made huge gains. So they conquered northern Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt successively between 611 and 621, and in effect conquered it's well, the richest agriculturally and industrially, the richest part of the East Roman world. So that the Romans were then left with Asia Minor, the Balkans already, under threat from Slavs and their nomad overlords. They're left with Asia Minor, the Balkans under threat, and North Africa. And certainly with much reduced resources, how did they turn it round? They begin to turn it round in 622. Uh, what we learn is that the army was sort of exercised and trained intensively, that uh, great efforts were made to infuse it with a spirit of holy war, that they were fighting for the Christian faith against an alien, hostile, dualist faith of the Persians. That and at a later stage, in 624, Heraclius reveals in what he says that the something akin to jihad was being preached. That is in the sense that soldiers who were killed in battle would go straight to paradise. So, in terms of turning around the fortunes of war, uh, I the all important thing
Propaganda
is
played a huge part then.
what?
Propaganda played a huge
Propaganda,
part.
yes, but propaganda to affect the as well, the Persians, to undermine the Persian will, but in particular these sort of morale boosting speeches, so yes, propaganda at home, basically because the crucial thing was to raise the morale, the confidence of the Roman forces, along with intensive training to give them both a stamina and a speed of movement that was superior to that of the Persians. So what you then have is that Heraclius is in command of a small force, and it can outmaneuver the Persians, and basically can choose the time and place for combat. And in effect, um, it happens on a small scale in 622, and then after an intermission of 1 year in 623, it happens on a larger scale in his two counteroffensive campaigns. He can pick off the enemy one by one, taking out individual forces one by one, whereas he would have been grossly outnumbered and almost certainly defeated had he faced them all together. So speed of movement, confidence, and brilliant, brilliant strategic command lie at the root of the East Roman victories.
Mm. Were Heraclius or Chusero, were they fighting? were they on the front line themselves, or were they just remaining in the capital and letting the troops and generals fight the wars for them?
Now, the traditional that's a very good question you ask. The tradition was for the Persian Shah to go to war and to enhance his prestige at home by military success, and for the Roman Emperor to stay put in Constantinople and dispatch his armies, and if his armies were successful, to appropriate the success, and if they were failure, to blame the generals. But in a way, it's almost reversed at this time. Not quite, because Khusro did was in command himself of operations in 603 when Dara was captured, when Dara was besieged. And he was taking the field in 624. He was in command of a great army which was being assembled close to Lake Urumia in Iran, in Iranian Azerbaijan. But an army that never took to the field because it was attacked, surprised before it was properly mobilized, and Khusro fled. But apart from that, Khusro is uh, basically living well away from the front, and Heraclius from 622 and then 624 was in personal command of the army in the field and was gaining great credit by sharing the labors of his men. And those who wrote about him made much of his personal participation in all aspects of the war.
Were there mutual respect between both respective leaders? That did they have like or did they was there hatred between the leaders, or whether like they had really respect for both their sides?
That is impossible to say, but I think it would be surprising if there was. You see, Khusro, the Persian Shah, in the year 615, in effect declared it as his aim to destroy the East Roman Empire because he refused to recognize Heraclius as a client ruler. He refused all possible territorial cessions by the Romans. He was in effect setting about the conquest of the East Roman Empire. So I think that being so, it was a war for Heraclius. It was a war to the death. He was fighting for the principal Christian state on earth, a great empire which was on its last legs and was being threatened with annihilation by Khusro.
How close was he to succeed in this? Because it does seem to be before, of course, the counter-offensive by the Romans. It does seem to be fairly close in succeeding.
Yes, indeed. Oh, yes, indeed. But there was another factor in all of this. And I think it's this other factor that explains why Khusro was ready to try to basically destroy the old world order in which a Roman and a Persian power had coexisted. And the new factor was the emergence in Central Asia of a third great power, that of the Turkish Khaganate, a Turkish empire stretching from the inner Asian frontiers of China to Ukraine, and in a position to pose a very, very serious threat to the Persian Empire. And uh, the Heraclius managed to make contact with the Turks. So the Turks were involved in the last phase of the war. They were involved in the years 626, 627, 620, 626 to 628, the end of the war. And so that threat plus the successes of the small Roman army in the West, combined to turn the governing elite in the Persian world against Khusro. And just coming back to 615, when Khusro set about the destruction of the Roman Empire, by then he was well aware of the strength of the Turks, and in my view, reckoned that he had to eliminate the Western threat if he was going to be able to cope with Turkish power over future generations.
Hmm. And I want to ask, because it's interesting, if he had been able to succeed in annihilating the Eastern Roman Empire, how different would the history of the Middle East have been up until today had he succeeded in this? Would Islam eventually have been, would it, instead of having Islam versus the Romans, would it not eventually have been Islam versus Persia instead, or perhaps,
Yeah. Yes,
would there have been much different at all if in the terms of crusades
yes.
or holy wars in the Middle East had it succeeded in this?
That's a very good question. It's, of course, a hypothetical, so it's very hard to answer. I think the answer depends entirely upon whether one thinks that the extraordinary success achieved by the Arabs in 20 years between um, the Prophet's death in 632 and 652, 20 years, that's the time it took to destroy the Persian Empire, uh, uh, leading to the death of the last Shah as he fled, and to strip the Roman Empire of all its rich Middle Eastern provinces. Um, Whether one thinks that these extraordinary successes are primarily to be explained by weakness on the part of the Persians and the Romans at the end of their long war, or by an extraordinary strength on the part of the Arabs. Now, if you think that it's weakness on the part of the northern powers, then I think the whole future of the world might have looked different. But my view is that the combination of a new religion, well, it's both new and old. I mean, it's a continuation and an absorption and an amplification of Judaism and Christianity, taken onto a new stage in Islam, um, taken onto a new stage in the sense that the power of God was infinitely greater than that envisaged by Christians and Jews. The power of God, affecting life on earth. Evidence for that, the Arabia. You just look at the desiccated landscape of Arabia to see how plants, animals, and man were at the mercy of the environment. So you both have a God infinitely more awesome, grim, distant, ahuman, and then you have individual submission to that God, far greater than that of Christians and Jews. So you've got an astonishingly powerful mixture of a religion on the one hand and the city state with highly skilled diplomatically, economically, politically, the Meccan city state. And the two things get put together when Muhammad and the Medinans take over Mecca in 630. And I view that combination of religion and organization as lying at the start of the whole process of Arab conquests. And that I think the Persians they might have had greater success initially. In fact, in the event with after the war ended, the Persians did succeed in driving the Arabs back from their when they first attacked their capital, Ctesiphon ve Ardashir, on the Tigris. They did push them back to the edge of the desert, and there the Arabs fought I mean, clearly lots of reserves came up, reinforcements. But the Battle of Qadisiyah, which I think can be dated to the 6th of January. Um, I'm now forgetting the year that I put the date in. I think it's 6th of January, 638. There, the full Persian army was crushed by the Arabs. So I think that the 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 principal difference would have been that the Arabs would have not faced the rump Roman Empire, which held out against them. They would have overrun the whole Middle East and the future territories of Byzantium up to Constantinople. And Christian, Roman, Germanic, Christian Europe and Scandinavia and Britain beyond it would have evolved. I'm sure that it would have held out because the lines of communication would have been so long. The Arabs, yes, got into Spain, but they couldn't really get into France. I think that European history would have carried on probably pretty
But the
much,
Middle East history would
but
have
the Middle East would
changed.
have been utterly different. Utterly, well, no, sorry, it wouldn't have been utterly different, but it would have been utterly different in that the ongoing battle between Arabs and Byzantines wouldn't have been occurring. But I think you would have got an Abbasid Empire which reached its zenith basically in the early no in the mid to late 7th century, early 8th century, running from Spain to Central Asia. That you would have got. It would have defeated the Tang Chinese in battle in Central Asia in 751, causing knock-on effect that basically Tang power, civil wars, and then a diminution of Tang power. Uh, so I think you would have had a different world, and Lord knows what would have happened by the time we get into the 11th century.
Maybe it would be
Uh,
for the better, who knows?
you, because burgeoning trade in Europe, the rise of great cities, a series of warlike monarchies, trying their strength against each other, the Germanic fighting spirit dominant. That's something the Arabs would have been facing, probably with the Balkans being the arena of warfare, the principal sort of theatre of war between them. So Balkan history would have been even worse than it actually was.
I want to ask, was this last great war between Khusro and Heraclius part of the cause the rise of Islam in with them being busy fighting each other that caused the rise of Islam as
Uh, well, I don't think that either great power was really capable of intervening effectively in what would be going on in inner
I
Arabia,
mean with
in the
them being busy
Hijaz.
fighting instead of focusing instead and
But
that they
but
were distracted from the Arab Middle East.
but they weren't capable. I mean, they did try to manage Arab clients, but they could only do that on the north. The tribes of the northwest and the northeast. And it's plain that the Muslims were far more effective at sort of winning over clients on the northern side. So they won them over to their side before the campaigns of conquest. So I don't think that the great powers were capable of intervening effectively, either diplomatically or militarily, in the affairs of inner Arabia. So the fact that they were fighting in the north, yes, it means their influence diminished. But more important than that was the fact that it gave a sense of coming doom to the whole world in the Middle East and further afield and in Europe. It seemed to be a war to end all wars. And the apocalyptic fears that dominate the first utterances of the prophet, I think, are best explained as by taking place at the time of this great war, when the whole known world seemed to be approaching its end. So that I think is the connection, not not that there was a diminution in the influence of the northern world in Arabia. Yeah, it was, but it was never of any great significance. But that the northern world, the war in the north, seemed to presage the end of the whole world, and that's what set Muhammad off, and that was what he was warning his listeners was about to occur, and that they must submit, and that they would imminently face a last judgment in which every word, every thought, every deed would be taken into account. And they individually before that awesome judge, Allah.
I want to talk a little bit about the conclusion and the difficult, like you say in your book as well, the difficult road to peace between
Yes.
Khusro and Heraclius.
Yes, well, principally because uh, the uh, after the extraordinary successes achieved by Persian forces in the first two-thirds of the war, um, the uh, there were obviously there was a great reluctance among the ruling class in Persia to return to the status quo before the war, which had been so disadvantageous to
Were
the
there
Persians.
nobilities that profited from the war that really prospered because of the road to
No,
power
no,
because of the
no.
war?
One of the great complaints against the regime was that trade and commerce was basically suffered greatly from the war, and that the sons of the nobility was well, they were dying and they were having to serve far, far away from home for long, long years. So no, the war was a strain on the economy and on the upper layers of society, so that it was unpopular for that reason. And when the Turks came in and it seemed it would be endless, it then became intolerable. Um, uh, now, just remind me. I've gone astray. Remind me of the question you asked me.
The difficult road to peace and how
Oh
that
yes,
we kind of were
yes,
on. We didn't really derail because you kind of were onto something when you talked about how the endless war that it seemed to like an endless stalemate that it never ended. So
yes.
was this part of the reasons why Persia and
Well,
Rome
so
decided to go make peace at last?
there was this general reluctance on the part of the Persians after so many sacrifices to give up all their gains. So that's the principal problem behind the peace negotiations. But then there's a particular problem. There's a political problem, which is that the commander in chief in the West, a general with the honorific of Sharvaraz, Boar of the realm, rebelled against Khusro's son, who had made basically sued for peace, and uh, he that induced a period of political turbulence because Shahbaraz was successful. He gained the throne, but only for a few weeks before he was ousted. And then there's a rapid succession of regimes. And of course, the problem for the regimes was that they couldn't make huge concessions. Uh, Khusro's young son, Karvad Shirawi, was plainly ready to make concessions to the Romans, um, uh, but Shahvaraz had objected to that. And then when Shahvaraz didn't last long, so it didn't arise, but subsequently uh, um, to offer large concessions to the Romans was basically to commit political suicide. so it took a good 2 years before finally a Persian regime headed by a daughter of Khusro's called Boran made peace and basically yielded up all the territories that Khusro had conquered, including the territories which had traditionally been part of the Persian Empire, that is, in Western Armenia and Western Georgia, which the Romans had, and along the Kurdish Taurus, which the Romans had acquired in 590. So basically, they ended up the war back where they had begun in a position of military weakness in the West.
You talked about the water trade and all wars, and kind of similar to what the Great War in 1914 to 1918,
Yes,
that it wasn't felt that it really was for nothing in the end.
indeed, indeed, indeed. Well, except yes, we ended up at pretty much in again the status quo, but a highly, I mean, a great continental power, which plainly, I mean, look, we can't enter into
Mhm.
the origins and causes of the First War, but clearly the German Empire was basically destroyed in the First War. But you're quite right. It then leads to a new sort of imperial project, the Nazi project in the 30s, which is even worse, far, far, far worse, and it caused far more havoc to humanity.
You spoke about the reluctance on the Persian side, but were they also reluctant on the Roman side as well to make peace, or were they like, we kind of had enough, and now let's try to make peace as quick as possible, or were they worried that there would be no territory, that they would not go back to the borders before the war, or were they the
We
reluctance on that on the Roman side as well?
Yes, indeed, and there plainly were divisions on the Roman side. There were some who wanted to exploit the victory to the utmost and basically to make more gains, to exploit Persian divisions. But but sort of realists and pragmatists prevailed, and they were ready to settle. I think, they were ready to settle probably from the first peace, peace um, uh, overtures in spring 628. They were probably ready to make peace with a frontier somewhere between the one achieved in 590 and the traditional frontier. Um, uh, but so I don't. The difficulties weren't on their side. I mean, those who wanted to exploit the political divisions and, in effect, take over a large part of the Persian Empire, that was a minority view, and it didn't affect their diplomacy.
Hmm. So, who were it seems that the Romans were the clear victor in this war, even though the Persians seem to have the clear advantage in this war. But in the end, it would seem that the Romans were the clear victor here.
Yes, yes, and that can be attributed first to Heraclius's um, regime's reorganization, training of the army, propaganda, and Heraclius's generalship. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, to the looming threat posed by the Turkish Khaganate on the other. And the Turks had crossed the Caucasus and occupied uh, what is now ex-Soviet Azerbaijan, and Georgia and were moving into Armenia um, uh, during the peace negotiations. So that was a continuing pressure on the Persians, so that basically the Turks didn't just threaten Persia; they acted and they occupied a large chunks of territory. So basically, the Persians lost, but they lost to Romans and Turks.
Mm.
Of course, your listeners may wonder what on earth happened to the Turks. Well, the Turks in the same in the year uh, I'm trying to remember. I think it's 629. The Tang Chinese made a long planned intervention in the east, and that which led to the implosion of the Turkish Empire. So they vanished without trace from the northwestern part of the Iranian Empire by the end of 629. But they played their part in an enormous part in helping the Romans to victory.
We kind of touched a little bit upon this already, but I want to talk a little bit about the legacy of this last Great War, if you wouldn't
Uh,
mind.
uh, um, yes, it obviously it lived on. It lived on in the memory of the Byzantines much more than in the memory of the Persians. I mean, from the Shahnameh of around about the year 1000 of Firdausi really passes over all of this. You've got the great reign. Khusro II is there and a great ruler, but the war is sort of passed over virtually in silence. On the Roman and Christian side, it gradually develops into a legend basically associated with the fragments of the true cross, which were removed from Jerusalem after its conquest by the Persians and were recovered by Heraclius, handed over to him by Shalmaraz once he got to Ctesiphon. So a whole series of legends grow up around the true cross and Heraclius basing himself so as to be able to get into Jerusalem. So it's yes, there's a sort of legendary life of the war afterwards. Then there are versions of the war, highly distorted versions of the war, which we pick up in sources. One is an Egyptian, a Christian, actually an Orthodox Christian, uh, writing in the 11th century in Egypt, Eutychius, who has a sort of weird story of the last great war in which all the campaigns have been muddled up and um, but you can see it's history garbled, but you can see the truth there, which is a huge Persian advance and then an amazing counterattack by Heraclius. But all the details have gone. So the answer is yes. It lived on in the minds of the Byzantines, who remembered the events. It lived on in the minds of the wider Christian world in this legend of the true cross and a very garbled memories of it were recorded in non-Byzantine sources.
I think we're gonna round it up there. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a great pleasure to have you on today. Before you go, of course, where can people find your book, The Last Great War of the Antiquity? And do you have anything else you want to promote or links you wanted to share in the description? Or where can people find you on social media if they have any further questions about the Last Great War of Antiquity?
Well, the like as regards the book, basically Amazon is the easiest way to
Mhm.
get it. Um, the and it is in paperback now, so it's a bit. I think it's in paper. It ought to be in paperback. But perhaps it's not in paperback. Now, my previous book, they were put into paper. Did you get a hard copy
And
of
this is
it?
the hard copy, yeah.
Yes. Um, so basically Amazon.
Mm. It is also on
Amazon.
Audible as well, I believe.
Yes, yes, it is indeed. Um, uh, the As regards communicating with me, I don't have a website, but basically any university teacher or ex-university teacher in Britain, we're there on Google. So you simply Google my name, and my details come up, including my email address,
Thank you
so
so
they
much
can
again.
communicate with me. So, and various people do every now and again, and I do my best to try to answer. Now, but I should apologize to your listeners. I've just come back from a week in Warwickshire, going to the whole of Richard Wagner's Ring of the Nibelungen. So my
Ooh,
mind were wonderful performances in this small
I'm
opera house.
jealous.
So my mind is I've still got motifs from the ring going through my mind. And so the terrible mistake that I made about confusing the date of the Hijra with the start of the date of Muhammad's preaching, that I blame on Wagner.
I don't. Okay, everyone, you heard it here. Thank you so much again. It's been a great
Right.
pleasure. I'm so jealous that you got to see you out in the live. And this has been What That H12. We are available on social media on Twitter/X under What That H12. You can find us on Instagram under What That H12. You can, of course, find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you are on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars. Or if you hated the episode, you can give us one. Though it would be nice with 5 stars. Or if you're an Apple podcast, please write a review. That would be very nice. I do love reading reviews if I get them. If you're on YouTube, please like, share, and subscribe. We are almost at 1,000 subscribers, so we'll try to do something special for that occasion when we reach that 1,000 number. Thank you again so much for coming on the podcast. This has been Valdez Well. I will see you next time.